In this video, we're going to walk through the process of creating an application, from the time it starts a general set of requirements all the way through until it's actually working. Our demonstration today is going to be building a consignment shop demo app. And here are general requirements. We need to create an application that can be used by a consignment shop to run their business. We need to know who the individuals or vendors are who have items in the shop, and we need to associate those vendors with their items. Each vendor should be assigned a standard commission rate, but that may need to be changed on a per vendor basis. The application should then track how much should be paid to each vendor, as well as how much money should be paid to the store. So that's our general requirements. It's a paragraph or two of information that describes what the outcome of the application should look like. But let's break that down into very specific requirements. We'll use these requirements later to say, yes, our application is done because it meets all of the given requirements. Okay, so we have this list here. Let's start breaking it out. We need to know who the vendors are. So how about a list of vendors? Next, each vendor has a set of items. So list of items per vendor. Now, it says here that we need to associate the vendors with their items. And if the items are a list of items per vendor, that indicates an association. So we'll leave that off as a specific requirement. So each vendor should have a default commission rate. And commissions can change. Finally, we need to track how much to pay the vendor, and then track how much to pay the store. So there we go. We've broken out our paragraph into 6 bullet point items. We may need to come back to this list and reevaluate if we find that there's a gaping hole in the description of the application. However, right now, this is our list of requirements. Once we meet this list, we should be about done our application. Now that we have our list of requirements, we can go one of two ways. We can either design our back-end system, or we can design our front-end system. Both need to be designed before we start building our application. Personally, I like to develop my back-end application before I work on the front end. This just helps me get that foundation and understanding of what the data is and how it needs to be displayed. So let's do that using Excel. I'm going to keep my requirements here on the left. That way I can continue to see what information I need to capture. Let's start with something simple. We have a list of vendors. This will be our first class. So, what items should be in our vendor class? Well, it should probably have a first name, a last name. We need to know what that commission rate is. And we can probably leave it right there for now. We still need to figure out how to associate the vendors and their items, but let's wait until we have a vendor list or an item list first. Now, before I move on, typically what I do is I also develop a list of data types just to kind of give me a leg up when I'm actually developing my class. In this case, first name would be a string, last name would be a string, and commission rate would be a double. We use double here because double is the standard way of representing a decimal number unless it is associated with money. So if we were talking about a dollars and cents commission as an actual amount, then we would say this would be a decimal type. But since this commission is a percentage, we use the type double. Okay. Now let's create a items class. And we'll go ahead and highlight that just like that. There we go. So for an item, this would be something that this person is selling, whether it's an article of clothing or a book or whatever else. So let's start with a title and a description. Something simple. And it needs to have a price. We need to know if the item's been sold or not. And we're going to need to know, hey, have we given out the consignment money for this yet? So when a person buys the item for $10 and the commission rate is 50%, we need to know, did we pay that vendor $5? Did we pay the store the other $5? So let's call this payment distributed. Okay. That should be good for at least a start. So our item types: string, description should be string as well. Remember that price is actually money, so we need to use that decimal type. Sold would be just a true or false, yes or no. So we want that to be a Boolean. And then payment distributed, again, that's just saying, yes, we've distributed it, or no, we have not yet. So let's call that a Boolean as well. The key when developing a back-end application is not to get caught up in knowing everything. Instead, start with what you do know, and then figure out where the holes are. So right now, I know that I have a list of vendors and I have a list of items. But what I don't know is, how am I going to keep track of the actual store itself? In this case, you know what? I'm going to create a third class, and let's just call this store. And in that store, we'll give the store a name. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky. Do we put an income here, or do we always just calculate that? I'm going to say for right now, we're going to calculate that, but I may revisit that later and say, no, we're going to replace this with some sort of income field. So now I have a store, I have a name. Let's figure out how all these different things relate. I could put a list of items inside of this vendor class right here. And that would meet our requirements because we need to know a list of items per vendor. The other way I could do it would be I could create a reference on every item to who owns it. The difference is when I'm looking at a vendor, I can know these are the items associated with that vendor. Or if I am looking at an item, I can know who is selling it. I think that I'm going to want to associate the vendor on each item. And actually, because of the way classes work, I could do it both ways. I could have a list of items on the vendor, and I could have the vendor on each item. But let's not get overly complicated. Let's just start with putting an owner field on here, and we'll give that a type vendor. And actually, I need to change these to be singular, item, and vendor. And the reason we do singular is because a class instance should be singular. It holds or contains one item at a time. Each instance does. So we want this to be vendor and item. Later, when we have a list of something, we'll make it plural. That way, we can differentiate, is this a list or is this an instance? So we'll have a list of vendors, and we'll call it vendors. And we'll have a list of items and call it items. Okay, so now I've associated each item with who owns it, the vendor. Now I need to know, should I put a list of vendors and a list of items in each store? And to me that seems logical. This way, each store is its own instance, and it has associated with it a list of vendors and a list of items. So let's call it vendors and items. The type should be item and vendor. Okay. It seems pretty simplistic, but that's our back-end design. There's a lot more that can go into a design. We could lay out the logic of how all these different things will associate, but I think that gets us a good start into how the classes should be laid out. And typically that's where most of the work needs to be thought through, is how you lay out that foundation of what data will be stored and how will it relate. The actual business logic of connecting the front end to the back end and how those interact and how data is created, updated, and deleted, that will come in time, but that's after we develop our front end and our back end. We then create that logic. So let's go and create a front end now. Usually when I create my front end design, I do it on paper. I draw it out. And the reason I draw it out is because it's very, very easy to start over again. You scratch something out, you change something, you put an arrow to where it should go, and you're good. But for purposes of demonstration, today, we're going to create our front-end design right in Visual Studio. So let's start with a new project. And we're going to call this project Consignment Shop UI. And the solution we're just going to call it Consignment Shop. And I choose the Windows Forms application in C# and hit OK. So what we have here is the very start of our Windows Forms application. I am called form1.cs. The first thing you should do is change that. Form1.cs is a horrible, horrible name. Let's change that to be our, just call it Consignment Shop. And yes, we want that rename to rename every reference to Form 1. The one reference it does miss is this Form 1 title. Let's go ahead and change that in our properties. So if we open up properties here and then select Form 1, we notice it actually goes right to that Form 1 text on our Consignment Shop form. And let's just call it Consignment Shop Demo. The other thing I like to do while I'm here is I like to change the default font. By default, the font on a Windows Forms application is 8-point regular Microsoft Sans Serif. Not exactly the most stunning font or the most readable size. So let's change that to be a 12-point font, We'll leave the font and font style the same, the way it is for now. That makes our form a little bigger, but we can even drag this a little further here. And then let's open up the toolbox. Okay, at this point, we need to do a few things. Let's set up our form with just some very, very simple and standard pieces. We'll start with a label. Drag that on. And the first thing you always do when you create a new item on a form is you rename the instance name of that item. Right up here at the top, if you're sorted alphabetically in your properties, is this thing called name in parentheses. This is the actual instance name of this class instance. Every item that you drag on the form is actually an instance of a class. In this case, it is the system.windows.form.label class that we're instantiating. Instead of calling it label1, let's call this header text. We also need to go down here and change the actual text to be something more appropriate. I just call it Consignment Shop Demo, which does repeat what's up at the top here, but that's okay. And the next thing we want to do is change that font to be a header style font. So let's make this bold and start with 24 and see how it looks. Yeah, it looks good. We can drag that around if we want and put it where we feel is most appropriate. Now that we have our label on the form, what do we need to see in order to have this shop function? Well, as a person walking in off a street, I want to use this to buy something. Or maybe we want the cashier to use this to buy something. This is where those requirements aren't very clear. It doesn't tell us, is this a self-service kiosk or is this a point of sale system for our clerk? And that's where we need to identify and kind of tighten down those requirements. Who's going to use this? So in this case, let's assume that it is the sales floor clerk that's going to use this application. When a person walks up and says, I want to buy this book, they're going to need to look that book up somehow. Once they look that book up, they need to have some way of purchasing it. So let's have first a list of items. Now a list, let's start with something that is pretty simple, a list box. Okay. This will be our list of items. That's every item in the store. Now, that's going to be a bit difficult to navigate, so we will have to have some way of filtering or sorting through it. But for right now, let's just say this is a list of everything in the store, and we will search through this list by scrolling. So I'm going to drag this over. Again, the first thing I do is I change that instance name to be something more appropriate, like items list or items list box. Let's go to list box because we may call something else items list. Let's stay with box. Okay, so we have an items list box. Let's go ahead and put a label on that so we know what it is. And we'll call this items list box label. And for right now, we'll just call this items. Or store items. Want to be a little more specific. And let's go ahead and change that font to be bold. Okay. So now we have, in theory, a list of items that are available in the store. And that's another key there, is that are available. And we'll figure out how to filter this list and sort it later. We just need to know right now, this is how it's basically going to work. We have a list of items. We have our label for our list. So now once the sales clerk selects an item in the list, what next? Well, we need to know what to do with that. We need to buy it. So we also want to see more information probably about that in item. So let's start by putting a button on here for purchase. Maybe something down here. And we'll, again, the first thing we do is change the instance name to be something a little more relevant. Purchase item. Now here's the next question before we move forward, is can they purchase more than one item? And I would say yes. We could do some type of shopping cart where they select an item and they say add to cart, and then they purchase it. Or we could say, you know what, this is a really simple system. We're just going to select something and say purchase, select something else and say purchase, and create 4, 5, 6 different transactions. For a real store, that would not be appropriate probably, but for our demo that could work. It would make things a little less complicated, but for purposes of this course, let's go ahead and create a shopping cart as well. So instead of purchase item, let's say add to cart. And then on the actual button text, let's say add to cart. And now what's going to happen is when a person selects an item from the list, they're going to click on add to cart, and it's going to put it in some type of cart. Now let's create a shopping cart list. So that would seem to be the same as this right here. So I'm going to select the first item, then I hold down my control key and select the second item. This allows me to select more than one item at a time. I'm going to hit Control C to copy. I can also go to the Edit menu and say copy. And then I'm going to unselect those and hit Control V. Now this pastes them in a really weird spot, and it actually overlaps items, and it could cause some concern, except for the fact that both of these new items are selected together. So if I click and hold on either item, I can click and drag. So let's click and drag and put that right about there. Now the key here is don't click on just one of the items or click off these items before you're done placing them where you want them to go. See, these two items kept their relationship to each other so that they now still match the original copied item. So you can move these wherever you want. You can use the nice guidelines to help us figure out where things are going. And based upon which item we move, notice that the guidelines change because it's a relationship to what we're moving. Since I'm moving this big box, it gives me the two big blue guidelines for aligning with the other box. If I move this label instead, it gives me the purple underscore, because that's how we're aligning these two labels. So it all depends on which item you drag. And that's about right. So now we need to do a couple things really quick before we do anything else. We need to change these two instance names. Notice label 1 and then list box 1. Because we've made a copy, two instances cannot have the same name. Therefore, it's given them a generic name of label 1 and list box 1, not the right item name. So let's call this, what do we call this? We call this item items list box label. So let's call this shopping cart list box label. And then let's call this shopping cart list box. All right. Next, we need to change this label's text to shopping cart. So now what we have is our list of items from the store. We can add them to the cart, and that puts them into this list over here. And now we'll need to actually make a purchase of whatever is in our cart. So let's do a couple things here. First, we can move this up to be a little more clearly indicate what's happening. So if we change this to add to cart, we could put some sort of arrow here. There we go. To make it a little more clear what's going on. Now, let's put another button on the field. And here's what I do here. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that it's the same height as the other button. Width is not quite as important. The first thing I do is change that instance name to be make purchase. And I'm going to give the text just purchase. Okay, so the flow here is we find an item in the list. We select it and hit add to cart. That puts it in the other list, which is our shopping cart. And once the shopping cart is complete, once we have all the things we want, we then hit this purchase button. And this will take care of the process of paying the vendor and paying the shop itself, and it will mark those items as purchased. So that's the basic structure of our application. Now let's look at wiring the two things together. The first step in bringing this all together is to create our class library with that backend information we created in Excel. So let's go ahead and add a new project to our solution. So we have our consignment shop UI, which is our user interface, the Windows Forms project. But then on our solution, let's right click and say add new project. And this time we will select class library. For the name, let's call it our consignment shop library. And now we have a new class library. The first thing I always do when creating a class library is a delete class 1. So let's right click and say delete. We don't need it. Now let's take the information we created or we gathered in Excel and put it directly into our class library. So let's move this over here. We're going to unpin this so we have a little more space. And now we have our vendor, our item, and our store class we need to create. So let's right click on our project, our consignment shop library project, and say add new item. We could use a shortcut down here for class, but new item brings us to our entire list, and the class is already selected. Let's call this the vendor class. Okay, so we now have our vendor class. The first thing we do when we create a new class is to make it public. And we need to add a set of properties, the first name, the last name, and the commission, according to this list over here. We could do this in a couple different ways. One, we could create a full property for every single item, or we could create an auto property for every single item. My preference is to create an auto property and then only expand out to a full property when I find that it's needed. So let's create an auto property for first name. We could type this all out, but if you type prop, this will bring up the snippet list for property. And if you hit tab twice, it actually inserts the snippet for an auto property. So right off the bat, we know it's a type string, so we already specified that. So string, and the name is first name. And that's all there is to it. So we'll do that again, prop, tab, tab, string, last name, and finally prop, double, and commission. Now, you don't need to be doing a lot of thinking at this point about the actual names or the types, but rather, since you already have that mapped out, you can start thinking through, hey, am I missing anything? Or is this going to work the way I think it's going to work? You start questioning your design, not in a way that destroys the design, but in a way that really aids the solidity or the how good the design is. So think through, am I missing anything? So, for example, a vendor. Is there anything else that a vendor might have or need to have associated with it? And at this point, I can't think of anything, so don't worry about it. That's fine. But that's just something to keep in the back of your mind, is think through, is there anything obvious that I've overlooked? And the reason why we develop in Excel and then come back later and do our actual development in Visual Studio is because it gives us a bit of time and a little bit of distance with our design. That way, when we come back and start putting it into Visual Studio, we have that fresh set of eyes to really look over and see, is this the right choice? Okay? Go ahead and hit save on that. Let's go back to my Solution Explorer and back to my project, my consignment shop library. I'm going to right click. I'm going to add a new class. So let's choose class this time just to be different. And see the same thing comes up the same way. And I'm going to say that this is the item class. And again, I'm going to make this public. So public class item. And this right now has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 properties. So let's go ahead and add those. Prop, tab, tab. Type of string. That's title. Type decimal. That's the price. This is a type bool. Bool. And here's a tricky one. Owner is a type vendor. Vendor. Now notice I did this in the order that I can actually create a type vendor in my item class because I've already created that vendor class. If I'd swapped these two around, I wouldn't have the class in here to use as my type. Now I could still type it in there. In fact, I probably would, but I would get that red squiggly until I created the vendor class. So it's just something to think about when you're developing. Don't panic if you see the red squiggly, or don't panic if your type isn't there yet. just know why, why it's a red squiggly or why it hasn't yet been put in place. Let's go ahead and save on that. And we need to add one more class. So add class. And this one is of called type store or called store. That's the store class. Again, make it public. And we have three properties here. We have the string, that's the name of the store. And then we have, now here's where we didn't quite specify clearly enough our types. So we have this property, and it's called vendors. But what's the type? We said it's a type vendor. Okay, but if I do that, remember that we named vendor singular because each instance will be one vendor. So in our store, we want to have more than one vendor. That's why we call the actual name vendors. So the type isn't of type vendor, it's actually of a type called list of vendor. Okay? So now we have this public list of type vendor. We call it vendors. And again, for items, same thing. Oops, prop, list of item. We'll call that items. And again, to get that yellow box to go away, I can just hit enter after the last item just to take me away from editing that last property, and I can just backspace away. That's just a cleanup thing. It's not necessary. It's just a visual way of completing the process. So I now have three classes that I brought from Excel, and I just simply typed in what I had and thought through the process a little bit to make sure that I hadn't missed anything, or that I hadn't put something down that wasn't quite right. And in this case, I did modify a little bit in the fact that these two right here were in fact lists of that type, not just single instances of that type. Okay, so now I have my back end essentially done. These are my three data structures that I need to build my application. At this point, we're now looking at how to wire the front end up to the back end, and then how to put that business logic in place to make things work the way we want them to. When looking to wire up a user interface, I usually start at one little piece and move forward from there. I don't try and do everything all at once or make a bunch of changes, but instead I do one little thing and make sure it works, and do the next little thing and make sure that works. So the first thing I would do before I do anything else is I hit the start button. And let's just make sure that the project works before I mess with it. When I do, this pops up. Great. I've got two lists that are blank. I have two buttons that don't do anything. And of course, the form itself can resize. Okay. So I know that at least when I hit that play button, something happens. Now that we have a working form, let's go ahead and start by populating one of our list boxes. In this case, it makes a little more sense to populate our store items because our shopping cart is going to be populated by adding items to that cart from our other list. Right away, this highlights an issue we have, and that is we have no data to put in this list. So when this application first starts, there are no vendors, there are no items. What do we do? Well, in a full application, we would have some type of form that would allow us to enter new vendors, enter new items, and then save all of that data to some sort of database. In our case, in order to get something going, let's go ahead and create some dummy data. So I come over here to my Solution Explorer. I'm going to right-click on my consignment shop form and say View Code. I can also get here by hitting F7. Okay, so now this is the back-end code for our form. I'm going to create a new private method called setup data. And what this is going to do is create some dummy data for us to use. And right away, I have another question. Okay, so I want some items and some vendors, but where do I store that information? Well, in order for the form to have access to this data, which is what we want, because we want this list box here to display our list of items. In order for that to be possible, we can't declare our information inside of a method, because then once we hit the end of that method, the data gets destroyed. So let's instead create our data at the form level. So I'm going to go ahead and create a private list of type vendors. And wait a minute, we don't need a list of vendors and a list of items, do we? Because we have this class here called store. And a store gives the name of the store and also gives a list of vendors and a list of items. So instead of creating a list up here of vendors and then a list of items, we can go ahead and create one called store. And initialize it. Now, it's yelling at me because it doesn't know what store is. But we can see that we actually created it over here. The problem is that we have not connected this library over here, this library, to this user interface in any way. Therefore, this user interface cannot see the information inside of this library. To fix this, in our user interface, let's right-click on References and say Add Reference. Under the Solutions section, this is all the different projects in my solution I could reference. You notice this consignment shop library with this checkbox next to it if you highlight over it or hover over it. Check the checkbox and hit OK. Now if you notice in our references list we have this consignment shop library reference. Great! So now the consignment shop user interface can access the library consignment shop library. Now what you don't want to do is go the opposite direction. In fact, you can't. If you say add reference here and select consignment shop UI and hit OK, you're going to get this pop-up that says, hey, you can't do that. Adding this project as a reference would cause a circular dependency. Well, that's a good thing that it stops you, but it also highlights the fact that you don't need two-way knowledge. The user interface needs to know about the library in order to use it, but the library should not know about the user interface. And the reason for that is because we're splitting apart these dependencies. The consignment shop library should be independent of any user interface. That way, if we decided later to create a new user interface that uses WPF instead of Windows Forms, it too can access the library with no problems. And the library shouldn't have to change. So, we've added a reference in our user interface to our library. But we still get this red squiggly. But notice now if we hover over, notice this little blue underscore under the S, or if we hit Control dot to drop that down, We now have a new menu item, or actually two. One that says consignment shop library dot store, or the other one, the top one, says using consignment shop library. And what this indicates to us is that store is only part of the name of our class we want to access. We need to access the store by its namespace dot class name. And that's what this second option is referencing, which is consignment shop library, the namespace, dot store, the actual class name. The other thing we can do is make our lives a little easier by adding a using statement. Notice we have at the very top, we have a bunch of default using statements. These allow us to shortcut calls to certain methods. In this case, it's saying, do you want to add a shortcut for the consignment shop library? So you don't need to say consignment shop library.store every time you want to access that class. And yes, we do want to add that using statement. The only problem with adding that using statement would be if it stepped on the toes of some other library. If we had a different library that also had a store, that would be a problem. Note that by clicking that button, we add this using statement at the very top. We could have just typed this in, but that allowed us to skip the typing step. So now we have store no longer highlighted in red, and things look good. In fact, if we were to run this right now, nothing breaks. And that's always a good step to try once in a while, just to make sure that you haven't caused any problems or introduced any new bugs in your work. By checking often, you narrow down the possibilities for any bug that does appear. Because we only changed a few things, if a bug appears now, we can go back over those few things we changed and look to see where the bug is. If we changed 100 things and then found that we have a bug somewhere, it makes it a little more difficult to trace down where that bug is and why it was introduced. So now that we have a store, we can start by setting up some data in that store. So let's say store dot vendors dot add, and we need to add a new vendor here. So before we go any further, let's go ahead and show two different ways that we can add a new vendor here. The first way is to create a vendor object and call this, say, demo vendor equals new vendor, and then we add the information we need. Demo vendor dot first name equals Bill. Demo vendor dot last name equals Smith. And demo vendor dot commission equals 0.5. Okay, and then we have this demo vendor we can add to our list of vendors. And that's great. That's one way to add. We create a new vendor object. We instantiate it with this new vendor. We add the 3 items that it needs. And then we finally add this item to the list. If we wanted to add more than one item, we could simply copy everything except the actual definition. So we copy this right here and paste it again. Now what we've done is we've already declared this demo vendor variable once. So we don't need to declare it again. But if we reinstantiate it here, we can create a new person, a new vendor. And then we could say Sue Jones and the commission rate. And then add that. And now we'll have 2 people in our list. But there is an easier way. And so let's go ahead and comment all that out, just so we still have it and we can still test it later. But for now, let's come down here and say store.vendors.add. Right in here, we can create a new instance of vendor and then open curly braces. And what those curly braces allow us to do is to populate the initial object with its values. So first name equals Bill, a comma, last name equals Smith, and then commission equals 0.5. And we put a semicolon at the end of that line. This line right here, does a few things. The first thing it does is it creates a new instance of type vendor. It then populates that new instance with the initial values of first name, last name, and commission. This is different than creating a constructor that takes these objects. Notice the curly braces, not the parentheses. The curly braces say, we're just going to create a new instance, but then once the instance is created, I want you to put these values in for the fields. So it creates the new instance, it populates the new instance, and then it takes all that information and adds it to our list, all in one line. This is a bit simpler than these 5 lines. And yet it does the same thing. So let's copy this here and paste it again. And this time we're going to say Sue Jones, and again commission rate of 0.5, which would be 50%. So now we have 2 people add to the list, either the long and more explicit way or the quick way with a one-liner for each person. Before we go any further, I want to highlight a couple things here. First of all, if we go back to our requirements, we need to have requirement number 3 says each vendor should have a default commission rate. Well, we don't have that. We're specifying a commission every time. So let's go back over and modify our vendor class a bit. Now, how do we create a default commission rate? Well, the way to do that would be to create a constructor. Now, a constructor is a special method that gets run when a new instance of this class gets created. To create a constructor, we can either type it out or we can hit CTOR to use a snippet. And tab twice. Now notice for a constructor, you can tell it's a constructor because there is no type, return type. And that's because this is being executed when this instance is created. Therefore, there is no ability to return. So whenever you see a method with no return type at all, not just a void, but nothing there, you know it's a special method called a constructor. So now this constructor gets run whenever this class is instantiated with no parameters. To set a default commission, we can simply say commission equals 0.5. Now a default commission is 50%. So that's the first thing we can change. So now we can actually drop off the need to pass in a value for commission. We just now need to pass in the first and last name. If we wanted to, we could pass in a new value for the constructor or for the commission. But for right now, let's leave default the way it is. The next thing we need to think about is this store class. Let's look at it. We have two lists here, but a list has to be instantiated. If I were to call this add right now, the application would blow up. It would say, hey, you got an error. In fact, let's just show that off. So I'm going to take this method right here and call it. So now what's going to happen is, again, this is a constructor because it has no return type. So the consignment shop constructor, which is that's our form, the first thing it does is initialize components, and we leave that alone. And we actually don't ever put anything before the initialized components. We always put our code afterwards. So the next thing it's going to do is call this setUpData. And this is our temporary method that's going to create some dummy data for us. And the dummy data it creates right now is just 2 vendors added to our list of vendors in our store. And if we run this right now, we get this exception. And the exception is an unhandled exception of type system.nullReferenceException. Now here's where the actual helpful information comes in. Usually it's in this additional information section. In this case it says object reference not set to an instance of an object. At first it's a bit difficult to understand, but after you've seen this about 100 times, because you forget to do this every single time, it'll start to click. And what that's saying is, hey, you've not instantiated something that you need in order to use it. Remember that a class has to be instantiated unless it's static. In this case, what we've not instantiated is our vendors list. So to change that, let's go to the store class and let's instantiate it. Now I could instantiate right here. So I could say store.vendors equals new list of vendor. And if we run that again, it all works great. The problem is this is not the place to put that. Otherwise, I'm relying on every time someone calls a new store instance that they remember to instantiate that list. And in fact, they have to instantiate 2 lists. I don't like that. Instead, let's not repeat ourselves and instead put that right in our store. So if I create a new constructor and I say vendors equals new, vendors equals new list of vendor, and items equals new list of item. Now we've instantiated both lists in the constructor before they're being used. Having taken out that initialization line here, let's make sure that still works, and it does. This is what I'm talking about with testing small little changes. The front end didn't change at all. We don't see any data, we haven't used anything yet, but we did make some changes in the back end, and I wanted to make sure that things weren't going to break. And in fact, they did break. And I was able to debug and fix that problem right away because I knew I hadn't done much. I was just working with this vendor list. I wasn't working with items. I wasn't working with anything else. Just the vendor list and just adding 2 items to it. So I knew it had to be something related to adding a new vendor to my list of vendors. Okay, so let's get rid of this extra stuff here. I now have 2 vendors, and that should be good to get started. But now let's create some items. Store.items.add. We'll use the same method here. New item. And let's start with the title. Moby Dick. Description. Book about a whale. The price. $4.50. And the owner. And this is where things get tricky. We want to add and relate a person from the vendors list to our owner. Well, in this case, what we can do is say store.vendors and then just select one using the index. So what I've done here is said the vendor in the first slot, that's who owns the book. Obviously, that's not the way to do things when you're creating real data, but since we're using dummy data and we don't really care who owns the book, we can select and distribute who owns what based upon just 0 or 1, 0 or 1 for either Bill or Sue. We have a semicolon at the end of the line, and we still have this red squiggly here under price. Now remember that price is money, and so we use type decimal, not type double. But here's the trick: when you are writing out a static value like $4.50 or 4.5, that is determined to be of type double, but we're assigning it to type decimal, and that actually would cause a conversion. And double does not convert neatly into decimal because of the precision. So here it's yelling at us saying, hey, I can't convert a double to type decimal. But if you notice, the error statement at the very end of a line says use an M, a capital M suffix, to create a literal of type decimal. So basically, I just need to put a capital M after my number, and that now tells the compiler this right here is decimal, not double. And that's all there is to it. Now notice how I scroll off the page. I don't really like that. So what we can do is after every comma, we can go ahead and hit enter and break this apart a little bit. And finally, if you want to, we can actually highlight all lines and hit tab to move every line over a little bit. And now they are a little more in line, and we have one item per line. The reason this works is because C# will read continually, even over breaks in the line, until it hits that semicolon. So as long as you don't have a semicolon yet, it continues to read as if we can continue on multiple lines. But the one exception to that is you can't put a break in the middle of a string. If I do that, it breaks things. However, there is a way around that. If I were to hit the @ symbol beforehand, it says, okay, treat everything inside the string as a literal, not as a special character. So, but that's beyond the scope of what we need to do here. So just note that we can actually hit enter after every comma and separate these out onto their own lines. Okay, so now we've added one book to our inventory. Let's go ahead and copy this line and add a few more books, or a few more items. And notice the compiler said, hey, you know what? I want to make this look a little different. And that's fine. In fact, if we want these two to match, we could go through and hit enter ourselves and move things around, or we can come up here to this edit menu, go to advanced, and say, you know what, format my document for me based upon the standards pre-established. If I do that, these now match. The key with formatting is to be consistent. So if you do things one way, you should always do them that way. In this case, it's good to follow the standard prescription from Visual Studio unless you have a very specific reason not to. The reason for that is because by default, most people using Visual Studio will not be changing those standards, and so they will be following the same standards as you. Okay, so now I've added a second item, but it's the same as the first, so let's change that. Tale of Two Cities, and it's a book about a revolution. Really descriptive titles here and descriptions. Okay, the price, let's change this to be 3.80. Oops, 3.8. And let's say that Sue owns this. All right. And let's create a couple more. In fact, I'll actually paste 2 more in. And this one we'll say is Harry Potter, book 1. A book about a boy. Not exactly a great description, but that'll work. Book about a girl. And actually, I believe that would be Jane Eyre, not Jane Austen. Okay, book about a girl, and let's change this price to be $1.50. Maybe it's a little used. And we'll change this to be owned by our first individual, which is Bill. Okay, so now we have, right now it looks like a bookshop. We have 4 different books. Obviously, a consignment shop would be more than just books. And we've opened that up because they can be anything they really want. This could be, a car jack, and or it could be a dress or whatever. So right now we have 4 books though, and we've added those to our items list. We have 2 vendors, and we've associated each item to a vendor. And now what we need to do is do a little more cleanup on our store. The final thing is store.name equals, I don't know, seconds are better. That's the name of our consignment shop. So now we have all this data set up, and if we run this one more time, nothing breaks. That's great. Now I can actually collapse this down and say, okay, this method takes care of filling up our dummy data. Now we can actually do something with our application. So again, our first step, and we haven't even gotten to that first step yet, but our first step is to populate this list of items. Well, now we actually have a list of items inside the store object. So how do we connect that list to this box right here? Well, what we need is something to sit in the middle, and that is called a binding source. Okay, and again, we need to have that at the form level, not an individual method level. Once we have a binding source, we say ItemsBinding.DataSource equals store.items. What this does is it links our items to this items binding, the binding source. Now we need to link our list box to this binding source as well. This puts binding source in the middle between our list of items and the binding source, or the list itself, the list box. So we call this items list box dot data source equals items binding. That's our binding source. And finally, we need to give the list box something to display, the display member and the value member. Now what this is if we say item list box dot display member, item list box dot value member. What this is what's going to show up in this list. What do you want shown? Well, we need something descriptive that says, okay, it's the item, maybe the price, and that should probably be it. But we don't have any specific property that has both the name of the item and its price. And that's what this display member and value member are looking for. They want, in text format, so inside quotes, they want one property that they can display. So we need to come back to our items list and add a property that can be displayed that will show both the title and the price. So let's create a new property. I'm going to actually type it out this time. Public string display. I'm going to create a get for this. This is a full property, but it is a full property that does not have a backing field. What that means is we don't have a private variable we're going to use as the storage for this property. The reason for that is because this is going to be a read-only property that just uses other properties and puts them together. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to return string.format. String.format allows me to mash multiple items together easily. So in this case, I'm going to say I want the title, and then I want $, and the price. And this curly brace 0 curly brace is a placeholder, and so is this 1 right here. And what that's saying is the first value you pass into me goes here, and the second value goes here, because it's a base 0 counting system. So after our close quote, we hit comma, and they pass in our arguments. The first one will be title, and the second one will be price. And then I close it out with a semicolon after the parentheses. So now the value for title will get put right here, and the value for price will get put right here. So it's going to say Moby Dick, $4.50. So now my property is called display. I'm actually going to copy that. And the reason I'm going to copy that, even though I'm confident I can type out the word display easily, I'm going to copy that because I'm pasting it into a text field that has no IntelliSense. So if I put 2Ys at the end of display, it's not going to yell at me. It just won't know what that property is. So I always copy and paste just to be sure I'm specifically typing the right thing. So now I have a binding source. I have the data source for that binding source is my items list. The data source for my list box is that binding source. And my list box now has a display member and a value member of the property display. Let's run this and see what happens. Now I have 4 items in my list box. Moby Dick, $4.50. A Tale of Two Cities for $3.80. Harry Potter Book 1 for $5.20. And Jane Eyre for $1.50. So I've completed my first small task in my user interface. I've wired up a list box. Let's keep moving forward. The next thing I need to do is I need to make this button do something. Well, let's think through the logic of what's going to happen. I need to, when this button is clicked, take whatever is highlighted in this list over here, and I need to add it to a list over here. How do I do that? Well, let's break this problem down. Do I have a list for this shopping cart? Well, no, I don't. Let's create one. Alright, so now I have this private list of type item, and I call it shopping cart data. This will be my list of everything in the shopping cart. Right now it starts off with no items in it, and that's good. A shopping cart should start off empty. So we now have somewhere to put that data, but wait, we need to make sure that this shopping cart list is actually bound to this list box. We already know how to do that with our binding source, so let's do that again. Create a new binding source and call this cart binding. And then down here we create cart binding.data source equals shopping cart data. This time it's directly attached to our form instead of inside of an instance. Next, we say that our shopping cart list box dot data source equals our cart binding. Okay, so now we have the data source for the binding source. So the data source for our cart binding is our list, and the data source for our list box is our cart binding. So now cart binding is sitting in between our list and our list box. That's great. Next, we want to set the display member and value member. Shopping cart list box display member. And here we're going to use the same display member. So okay. So now I've wired up our second list box. And if we start this and run it, nothing breaks. Well, that's a good first step. Now what do we need to do? Well, we need to wire up this button to actually take something from this list and put it over here. So if we select the button and go over to our properties, and in our properties window, you notice this lightning bolt here. That's the events list. And this is a list of all the different events that are baked into the framework that are present on this button. In this case, it highlights for us what it thinks would be the default event to fire, the click event. And that's true. That's what we want. When a person clicks this button, we want something to happen. So if this drop down, right now this drop down has nothing in the list, but we could select a pre-made event if we had one. But if we don't have a pre-made event, there's a shortcut. If we double click in this white area, it creates the event for us. Now, be very, very careful when using events that you do not just delete the code without first going back and deleting the event entirely from this list and clicking off. Let me show you the consequences of not heeding that advice. So if I delete this code right here, and I come back over to my consignmentshop.cs design view, I get this nasty error. Not fun. To solve this error, I could dig into the code and find out where this reference was made and delete it, but that gets really messy because I'm messing with Microsoft's generated code. Not cool. The better thing to do, if you have the ability to, is to not do that or undo your changes that removed that code. So if I want to remove this click event, I have to come to the front end, find it, find that code, again under the lightning bolt, highlight it and hit my backspace, and then click off it as well. Okay, that clears that event from the list. Make sure there's no text in here at all. Now come back to your code, and if it's still here, and sometimes it will be and sometimes it won't, now you can delete that code. I would recommend that if you ever change any event, that you make sure that you go back to the front end and make sure nothing blows up. Okay? Now, this button, we did want that event. So I'm going to go ahead and double click here. Notice that it passes in two parameters to our method, the object sender and event args e. This is the required signature for an event, is to have those two things passed in. Now that I have my method and it's a private void, this is going to fire whenever I click the button. Just to show that that works, let's create a message box, messagebox.show. I have been clicked. And then I run this again. And I click the button. And I have been clicked. And just to prove it's just that button, if I click this button over here, nothing happens. So every time I click this button, this event will fire. What do we need to do in this event? Well, let's write out in comments, which the / comments help us by allowing us to put text into our method without actually having it compiled or do anything. So let's put in our comments what we think this button should do. The first thing I should do is figure out what is selected from the items list. Copy that item to the shopping cart. That's the next thing. And then the final thing, and the question we have to ask is, do we remove the item from the items list? So if a person selects an item and says, I want to add this to my shopping cart, do we take it out of inventory? And I'm going to say probably not. But I want to keep that question there just to think it through and really figure out, do my requirements say anything? Well, they don't. Do I think that's going to work better if I do it one way versus the other? I don't know. So for now, we're going to say, no, let's leave it in the list. So we need to figure out what is selected from the items list. And then we need to move that item to the shopping cart. So we have this items list box. Let's look through our list and see if we have it selected. Selected index, selected item. Gets or selects the currently selected item in the list box. Okay. So this right here would represent one item in that list box. The one that is actually highlighted. Let's try this out before we go any further. Let's say we know that that is of type item, because that's what's in the box, type item. So selected item equals okay, so what I've done here is I've actually put this selected item into a temporary variable. Now I had to use this parens item paren here to indicate that I know that the item in this list box, the selected item, is of type item. You mouse over this selected item, notice it returns a type object because there can be a bunch of different types stored inside a list item or list box. It doesn't know which type each list item takes. So we can just say, you know what, I know what type it is. It's a type item. So now, with our selected item, we can do this message box again. And this time say selected item dot, let's say title. Okay. And that way we know, yes, we're actually reading what the selected item is from our list box. So if we have a tale of two cities selected, we say add to cart, it pops up a tale of two cities. It knows what item is selected. Next, let's actually figure out how to move that over to our shopping cart. We know the first step was to figure out what is selected. We did that. We know that this item is now an item from our list that's been selected. We verified that with a message box. Again, small little steps and verify. So now step 2 is to copy that item to the shopping cart. Well, what is our shopping cart? We have this thing called shopping cart data. That's our list. We can simply say .add selected item. Now we can say whenever an item is selected, add it to our shopping cart data list. And since that list is bound to the second list box, it should show up here, right? Well, almost. In fact, let's run this and just see what happens. Gonna select Harry Potter book 1 and say add to cart, and nothing seems to happen. Let's go ahead and put a breakpoint right here on line 86 just to see what's going on. And if I hit Jane Eyre and say add to cart, let's inspect these different items. First of all, what's the selected item? Well, that's Jane Eyre. It's $1.50. It's a book about a girl. So that looks right. Let's look at our shopping cart data. That's interesting. Our shopping cart data has 3 items already in it. Harry Potter book 1, a book about a boy. Harry Potter book 1, a book about a boy. And Harry Potter book 1, a book about a boy. So since I clicked that button 3 times, it added that book 3 times to the list. And in fact, if I were to step over this actually step into it. Notice that the list now has 4 items, and the last one is Jane Eyre, A Book About a Girl. So, why is it that when I run this, I don't have any items in my shopping cart? The reason why is because we need to tell this data binding to refresh. To tell the data source, or the binding source, that the information has changed, we need to tell it, so cart.binding.resetBindings. What that's saying is, hey, wire this thing back up again because something has changed. And then we have to pass in a Boolean saying whether or not the type of the list, the schema for the list, has changed. In this case, the schema has not changed. We just added data to it. I'm sorry, we should say false, not true, because the schema has not changed. We pass in true if we wanted to change the entire list to be something different, a different type of list, from, say, items to vendors. Then we'd need to change that to be true. But for now, whenever we add something to our list, or modify our list in any way, we have to call this cart.binding.resetBindings. So if we run this now, we select A Tale of Two Cities and say add to cart. It now shows up in the list in our cart. Harry Potter Book 1, add to a list, and now we have 2 items in our list. This brings up an interesting wrinkle in the fact that if I were to hit add to cart like I did previously quite a few times when I was testing, if I were to add to cart, I now have a bunch of Harry Potter Book 1s in my cart even though I only can purchase 1. This is a consignment shop. We only have typically 1 of each item. If we have multiple of a certain item, we'd probably create different instances of that item and add it to the list. So if we had 3 Harry Potter Book 1s, we'd actually create 3 items called Harry Potter Book 1 and add each of those to the list. So what do we do about this? Well, we could say, you know what? We can modify this by taking items out of our list or not displaying them once they're added to the shopping cart. Or we could say, you know what? That's a minor bug for version 2 we want to fix. For right now, we just tell our people that you can't add the same book more than once. In this case, let's go ahead and say this is a version 2 thing, since this is already becoming quite an in-depth demo. Now that we have our items adding to the cart properly, we need to have some way of actually purchasing these items. In the purchase process, let's create an event for this. So on the click of the button, we want to do something. So let's again write it out. We want to mark each item in the cart as sold. That's it, right? If we look at our items, we have this sold Boolean right here that says, hey, you've sold the item. And that's really it. Once you purchase it, we just say, hey, it's been paid for. It's sold. Obviously, if this were a full point of sale system, we'd have to have some way of capturing, credit card information or cash or whatever. But in this case, we're just saying, hey, yep, you bought it. The clerk took care of the money, so they just hit purchased. So that's the only thing this button needs to do, right? Well, actually, there's one more step. The final step is to clear the cart. Once you've purchased something, we don't need to show it anymore, so let's go ahead and clear the cart. So we have this list called shopping cart data. We can say for each item in shopping cart data, item.sold equals true. That would mark every item in the cart to be sold. And that for each loops through every item in our cart data. So next, we can just say shopping cart data dot clear, and then don't forget we need that cart binding dot reset bindings false. Okay, so now we have marked every item as sold, and then we have cleared the data, and then we've reset the bindings. Let's just try this out and see how it works. Moby Dick and Jane Eyre purchase. They go away and the cart gets cleared. Behind the scenes, we'll have to figure out if we're actually setting the sold to true or not, but that should work. So this raises the next issue, which is, that's great, but this list of items in the store shouldn't show sold items. So once you buy something, probably shouldn't be in this list anymore. How do we solve that? Well, that is based upon some type of filter. Right now, we are binding our data source to store.items, everything in the store. What we could do is create a new list right up here that says, hey, only bind to this new list, and then put every item in the list and then start removing them when they're sold. That's a little kludgy. The other thing we could do is write in our items binding, our store.items, we could use this dot where Okay, so what I've done here is I've put a filter on my items list and said the list consists of every item where, it's kind of like a SQL statement, where in this X and this little arrow thing here and the X dot sold, what this is called is a lambda expression. What it's saying is, okay, for every item in my list, kind of like my for each loop here, okay? And it's going to assign every item to be called X. Just like down here I called every item item, the lowercase I. So I call everything X. So now this is a for each loop. So X is each individual item. X dot sold equals false. Okay, since this is a where clause, it's only going to return the items where this statement is true. So it's X dot sold equals false. I could have also said bang X dot sold or not X dot sold. But to be a little clearer, I said X dot sold equals false. And then this entire thing gets returned as an IEnumerable. And I just said, hey, return it to a list instead of an IEnumerable. Now I've bound this to my data source, this filtered list instead of the entire list. But don't forget, whenever we change a list, we have to reset our binding. Now our binding is called items binding. So whenever we make a purchase, we should say items binding dot reset bindings and then false because the metadata has not changed. Let's try this again. So if I add Moby Dick and Jane Eyre and I purchase, nothing happens. Interesting. Let's find out why. It turns out that if we look down here at this right here where we did the filter using the lambda expression and the where clause, this is generated once and then gets stored as an object. This list does. Therefore, when we rebind this item right here, it just looks for that hidden variable that has the initial list filtered. What that means is it's not going to refilter that list. In order to refilter that list, we need to come down here to where we're doing our resetting or our bindings. Before we do our reset bindings, we just need to re-establish what the item list is, or the data source is, for our items binding. And to do that, I just copied and pasted what was up here in our initial binding. I copied that and pasted it right down here after I made the changes to my items list, and then I just do my reset bindings like normal. Let's try this again. So I have Moby Dick, let's add that to the cart, and Jane Eyre, let's add that to the cart. I now hit purchase, and the other two items have now disappeared from the list. Jane Eyre and Moby Dick are no longer part of our store because they've been sold. That's exactly the functionality we want. Let's go back and look at our requirements. Our requirements are to have a list of vendors, we have that. To have a list of items per vendor, we have that. Each vendor should have a default commission rate, we have that. And the commission can change, which that can be changed just by changing that one property. We need to track how much to pay the vendor and how much to pay the store. Well, we don't really have that yet. So let's go ahead and add that last little piece in. If we go back over here and look at our list of store items and our list of items in the cart, we don't really have a spot right now where we can say, okay, this is our vendors and this is how much we need to pay them and this is how much the store is made. For sake of demonstration, let's go ahead and put all that information on this form. Typically, we probably put that somewhere else, maybe a different form, maybe a sub-menu settings kind of thing. But for now, we can start by putting it right on this same form. And to do so, let's create a list again. So I'll click on this list right here. I'm going to shift or control click and select the label as well. Control C to copy and then Control V to paste. I'll move that around and line that up. And again, the first thing we do is change our instance name. We'll just go to the top here, but we're in the lightning bolt section or the event section. So I click over here on this wrench with the document. Let's call our properties. And I scroll to the top. If your list looks something more like this, where you have different things grouped together and you can group and ungroup, that is grouped by category. Whereas I typically like to use the alphabetized list because I know either I know what property I'm looking for or I have a general idea of what the name might be. So let's change the label 1 to be vendor list box. And then this is the label, so vendor list box label. And then this list right here we'll call vendor list box. And finally we change this label's text to be something more appropriate like vendors. Okay. Now we need to have this list right here, the vendors list box, bound to our vendors. We already have the vendors inside of the store. So we just need to create a new binding source. One more binding source. Vendor binding. Let's call it vendors binding. We'll instantiate it. Okay, and then again, down here, just like before, we have our vendors binding dot data source equal to store dot vendors. And for right now, we're going to list every vendor. I don't see a reason to filter it. And then we say our vendor list box dot data source that's our vendors binding, and finally our vendors list box dot display member and our vendor list box dot value member. And what I do here is, since I don't know yet what to put in the display member and value member, I'm just going to leave this blank and put the code in place and then come back to it. In this instance, what we want to display is the name of the vendor, the full name, and then how much money we owe them. So let's go back over and look at the vendors list. When we were in items, we had this property called display that we created that passed back information formatted nicely. Let's do the same thing for our vendors. In fact, let's call it the same thing as well. So we have this display property now. That's a read-only property that passes back right now two things, which is not right. We want it to pass back first name space last name, and then how much money we owe them. So let's change this to be first name, and this to be last name. And the last item is how much money do we owe them? Well, that's a bit tricky. We don't know. And so here's where our first kind of question mark comes in, because remember back at the very beginning when we talked about our diagram, we said we want the item to have an owner, but we don't necessarily think that the vendor needs to have a list of items. Well, now we figured out that that may not quite be the way we want things to work. If we don't have a list of items, we don't know how much money we're going to get. There's no way for us to say, hey, this person got this much money, unless we come back over here and we look at this purchase button here. If we double click on that, it'll take us to our event. This purchase button here, we're marking each item as sold. We could go in then and say, hey, this vendor, whichever vendor it was, add that amount to their total. So we have a couple different ways we can go. One is we can add here our list of items to our vendor, and then we can search through that and say, okay, these items are sold and this is the amount they were sold for. The other way of doing it is to add a property to vendor called some sort of payment due. And then every time we click the purchase button, we add that payment due for each vendor that, for each item that vendor owns. So let's do the simpler of the two options for now. Maybe long term for a larger application, I wouldn't do this, but for a smaller application, let's just go ahead and create a new property. And I call it's a decimal because it's money now. Payment due. And this will be the amount of money that is due to this vendor from the consignment shop based upon sales. So, and notice I left this right where it was at, this display, and so I have a red squiggly. And that's intentional. The reason why is because I didn't have something to put here, and instead of putting something, a dummy something in here, like, two quotes, I left it blank so that I could not compile this. So if I were to hit run, or if I were to hit build solution, whichever, if I were to run this, it's going to give me an error saying, hey, you're missing something. And that's intentional because I need to remember to fix that. Now that I've got a property to put there, I can go ahead and fill that out. Payment due. So now this works. Now this display will show, John Doe, and they're due $15.85, whatever. But in order to populate this with any kind of real number, I have to come back over here to my consignment shop, look at the make purchase click, and every time I loop through an item and mark it as sold, I need to add that money to the vendor. So item dot owner dot payment due equals, and actually I'm going to do a plus equals here, because I'm adding to the initial amount because it's going to start off at 0, but if it already has $5.15 in it, I don't want to overwrite that. I want to add to it. So plus equals, and here is where we're going to get into a little bit of math. We say item.owner.commission, that's their percentage, remember it's 0.5 by default, times item.price. So what we're saying here is multiply the commission times the price and get back a amount due. Now it's yelling at me here because we're multiplying a double and a decimal. And it does not like that. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to convert one to the other. Could do that. And we'll see how that works. So what I'm saying here is, you know what? This will work as type decimal, this commission rate. The precision is fine because we know it's very precise. It's not like it's been rounded. And so 0.5 can be a double or a decimal. So let's call it a decimal. That way the multiplication will work and we can add that to our payment due. So now what we have, if we come back over here to our display member and value member, we can put in display. Display, remember, in our vendor list is first name space last name and how much we owe them. Let's just try this out. I have Bill Smith and Sue Jones, and I owe them each nothing. So if I select Moby Dick and A Tale of Two Cities, let's start with Moby Dick, add to our cart, A Tale of Two Cities, add to our cart, and say purchase. It now takes it out of the store, but nothing happens to our vendors. Well, don't forget, we need to modify our purchase to not just update the bindings for the cart and the item, but also for the vendor. So vendors binding dot reset bindings. We don't want to update the metadata. Let's try that again, see what happens. Moby Dick, Tale of Two Cities, purchase. So now Bill Smith is owed $2.25 and Sue Jones is owed $1.90. Now notice we have an extra 0 at the end of this. We can format that using some string formatting, but for right now that works. Every time we make a purchase, it removes it from our list and adds to our vendor's payout amount. If we look at our requirements, we now track how much to pay each vendor. The final thing we need to do is track how much to pay a store. To do this, let's go ahead and create a new label. Let's copy and paste this one right here. And let's line it up like so. The first thing we do is change the instance name, and this will be store payout label. And we'll change the text to be store payout or store profit. Let's call it store profit label. We could have a different instance name than the label name, that's not a problem, but I like to keep the two in sync so that it's easier to find when I'm looking in the code. So store profit, I'm going to go ahead and copy this label and paste it again, and I'm going to put it right here, right next to our store profit, and again change this label to be store profit text, or let's change it to be value. Store profit value, and the actual text, I'm going to start off with a $0.00. Let's put a colon after the end of that. These are little cleanup things that don't make a huge difference in your app except for the fact that it makes it look a little prettier. Okay, and let's drag this over a little bit more, give it a little bit more space. So store profit right now is 0. We run that, we add to the cart, everything works here except for the fact the store profit doesn't change. Obviously, since we have not done anything to this label. Let's change that. Whenever we make a purchase, we need to also change that label. Now, I could change the label directly, but then I have to, the label stores as text. And since we're dealing with numbers here, let's go ahead and create, at the very top up here, let's create another private variable. And we'll make this of type decimal, private decimal, store profit, and we'll start off at 0. Now, every time we add something to our shopping cart, we say every time I purchase something for our shopping cart, store profit plus equals okay. So this is a mirror of what the owner gets. However, that's not going to work unless the owner has 50%. Because don't forget, the store gets the other half, other portion. So if the vendor gets 40%, then the store gets 60%, not the other 40. Otherwise, we'd leave 20% unaccounted for. So, how do we deal with this? Well, we say 1 minus our commission. So now if the commission that the owner gets is 40%, then it's 0.4. So 1 minus 0.4 is 0.6, the other half of our percentage. So now a store profit is going to increase based upon the other half of the payment. But that still doesn't update our label. So down here, we're going to look back at that label. This label is called store profit value. So store profit value dot text equals string.format $0, and this will be our store profit. Okay, so what I've done here is said just throw a $sign on the front of it of whatever value comes out and put that in the text box. Let's try this. So now I have a book, I add to the cart. I have another book, I add to the cart. I purchase. I now have given out payments to 2 vendors, and my store profit is $4.15. I add one more book to the cart, and I purchase. My store profit is now $4.90, and Bill has a little bit of extra money as well. So that is a working demo of the consignment shop application. If we look back at our requirements, we have now tracked how much the store pays, or how much gets paid to the store. We've now tracked how much gets paid to the vendor. We've now tracked default commission rate and the fact that commission rate can change. And we have a list of both vendors and items per vendor. So we've met all of our requirements. That is how we can tell that the application is done or mostly done. In this case, there's probably some cleanup we could do to make it a little prettier. We could add a form to add vendors. We could add a form to add items per vendor, and a few other niceties as well. Maybe make this a little cleaner, break this out into its own form. But the essentials of the application are done. At this point, we can ship. And that is how you take an application from a idea in this paragraph form, how you break it down into requirements, how you take those requirements and put it into some sort of back-end data format that you can take and put into a class library, and then take that idea as well and put it into a front-end design, and then wire that design up into something that will actually work. So from start to finish, from idea to application, those are the steps to take.